This is episode number 1 with Davis Richardson. Welcome to the Archiologist Talks. The Archiologist is a collaborative platform that focuses on showcasing worldwide design projects from students and young professionals. This time around, though, we're creating a space to talk about design with the leading architects and designers around the world. Our goal for these conversations is to inspire and influence the young community. We're going to bring in tips, personal insights, and different perspectives of what design really is to each one of us. And I'm your host, Maria Flores. Alright guys, so today on the podcast we have Davis Richardson. He is a master's fellow at the University of Texas at Austin. He also holds a Bachelor on Interior Design from Harding University. He has been featured in podcasts, lectures, and conferences, even appearing on the TED Talk stage, talking about beyond sustainable architecture. He has a book out called Going Tiny, and is known in the architecture community for building his innovative tiny house on wheels. This is such an interesting conversation. We talk about how his background in interior design has expanded his knowledge as a designer. We also touch upon form and how it can challenge the status quo in our society. Then, Davis gives his personal insights and advice for architecture students. Let the talk begin. Hi, Davis. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? It's good to be here.
Everything is fine. Thank you so much for being the very first person that we have on the podcast. I think it's going to be a very interesting series of podcasts that we have lined up, especially for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm honored to be the first. So I'm excited to see where the conversation goes and what this turns into for you guys.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so just tell us a little bit about yourself. I saw on your Instagram and your website.
Yeah,
right now
so
you're
I'm almost done with my MArch 1 at University of Texas in Austin. I have one more studio I'm finishing up this summer.
Oh, really?
In August. Yeah, I actually already walked, and the family came into town and all that stuff, and didn't really feel real yet. So I'm almost done. I'm almost done with that. My background is in interior design. I have a Bachelor's of Arts in Interior Design from Harding University, which is a school in Arkansas. I graduated there in 2016. And I also, right now, I'm working part-time as a designer with a small firm here in Austin called Thought Barn. So we'll see. I'm finishing up hopefully in August, and we'll see where we go from there, but hopefully remaining involved with academics in some way or another, whether it's potentially teaching, but we'll see. I'm not sure.
That's really cool.
Yet.
Teaching
we'll see.
is
It's
great.
a fun world. Yeah, it's a fun world to be involved in. I feel like the academic world of architecture, especially now, it's just really exciting. I think it's been said that this is really like the first generation of students who are seeing each other's work, mostly because of Instagram and because of accounts like yours.
Oh yeah.
It's a really interesting time, and so hopefully just being able to remain involved with the discourse and things that are going on is what lies ahead. But we'll see.
It's very interesting. For example, I am a professor at the university here in Miami.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Florida International University, and I've been doing it for around a year and a half. I love it. It's honestly just like it's like studying again almost.
Yeah.
It's really cool. But anyway, tell me a little bit about that background that you have on interior design. How has it helped you right now?
Yeah, so interior design was really good because it made me think spatially a lot more than I was kind of predisposed to. As you mentioned, I'm really into object-oriented ontology. I'm very interested in form as a tool for architecture that architecture works through. Interior design was really good because it really taught me to think not just about form, but also about space, about human experience, about the ways that people use buildings and use architecture, which is a really excellent foundation. Some of my more recent work has been exploring, do we need to what kind of ideas can we explore that actually, I don't want to say get away from those things because those are really important, but thinking a little bit beyond, anthropocentric ways of designing, thinking about objects and forms as they relate to space. But I don't think I'd have the freedom to really explore those things and challenge our presuppositions about them if I didn't have a background in interior design. It was a really great program. It was a good way to sort of go into architecture school foundationally, and now being able to sort of think differently about things.
So why exactly did you say, I'm going to graduate with interior design and then I'm going to go into architecture? What was that thing that you said, I need the architecture background as well?
So I've always wanted to be an architect. Architecture was always the field that I wanted to go into. My uncle, growing up, he was an architect who worked for John Portman in Atlanta for a long time, and he was a big influence on me. And so I knew architecture was always a field I wanted to be involved in and study. The reason I studied interior design first actually was I was playing baseball in college, and being an athlete and studying architecture at the same time was going to be really difficult. And so I wound up at Harding to play baseball, got to play. It was a small school, a small program with interior design. And so we were able to sort of be flexible with my schedule and sort of work around it. Interior design was still demanding from a time standpoint. I mean, you still have studio, you still have the hours you have to put in. But exactly. It was a little bit of a different deal than being in a full-blown architecture program at a larger school where it can be just expected that you're going to be pulling all-nighters all the time and stuff, which I literally just could not do. So it was sort of, it's extended my academic career more than I probably originally would have liked, more than I had expected to. But I think in the long run, I'm really glad that I was able to sort of get that more diverse background and not just study architecture for 6 or 8 years or whatever.
I think it's really cool.
Yeah, I hope it makes me a better designer in the long run.
No, definitely. I think it will, because interior design is how you speak about it. They focus more on, I guess, like an individual level, And I feel like in some opportunities, that's kind of like what architects, some of them, they lack, or when architecture students, like scale or how a person feels. I think that's definitely very important that interior design actually does go into. But when you talk about form, new ways of challenging the status quo, how would you say, in your opinion, that form challenges?
Well, I think that there's this interesting, a lot of my interest is to your point about challenging the status quo. I think there's definitely like a political agency that underlies all that. To me, what is interesting is architecture never really directly deals with those things, though. I think we talk a lot in school about sort of especially like our generation, the kind of things that we care about now. We talk a lot about the sort of social, political nature and agency of architecture, but to me, it's always indirect. Like I think that there's never a direct one-to-one correlation of this building is about fighting the Trump administration, for instance. It's crazy at times we live in. It's hard for buildings directly to do that, right?
Exactly.
But what buildings do
basically to make a statement.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it takes, even in academic architecture, I mean, real buildings obviously take years and years and lots of money and construction issues, and it's just a long, drawn-out process. But even in school, it's the same way. I mean, it's, we may not be dealing with the sort of constructed realities, but it's still a long, indirect process. What you're making at the end of the day is a building, not a political protest sign, right? And that's stealing a little bit from some stuff that Mark Foster Gage has said. So I don't want to plagiarize there. Just he's written and talked about this a lot better than I have. But so at the end of the day, we're making a building or we're making some form of architecture. And so it's always indirect. But what architecture does and what it has the capacity to do is it always is like, it is always the background to everything else in our lives. Like especially in urban environments. I mean, literally, we are surrounded by architecture on a day-to-day. It is what we are looking at and what we are experiencing. It's our,
Yeah.
if you think about aesthetics, not just necessarily as how something looks, but as the idea of aesthetics as the sort of like buffer between what we see and what actually exists outside of ourselves. Architecture is really one of the most prominent aesthetic phenomenons that exists in our world.
Yeah.
And when you think about that, like that, there is a very real power in the way that buildings present themselves to maybe realign the way that we see the world. And so what I'm interested in is form for form's sake. I think is certainly interesting and valid, but I'm interested in forms which maybe withhold or reveal some things about themselves and cause us to sort of look deeper at them, which may sound sort of like this narcissistic way of thinking about architecture, like, oh, you just want people to look at your buildings. But it actually is powerful, especially today in sort of ever fast, world that we live in on Instagram, where you just flip through and double click stuff you like and move on, where you read news headlines but may not actually stop to read the article. To sort of, the closest architecture can get to sort of changing those things, developing sensibilities within us that go, wait, I actually want to look at this longer and discover what's actually there because there's something that I'm not fully getting. That's a really powerful thing that we have the capacity to do. So I think form plays a role in that. I think there's also a way of like diverting very clear readings of form, specific forms that is actually more powerful. So it's form, but it's also graphic. It's also surface, and it's also depth and complexity. So there's a lot of things that go into that. But I think that's sort of where I'm interested right now is like, how do you divert clear readings?
It's very interesting. When you talk about the form in general, though, what form are you talking about? Is it, a shape that you produce in Grasshopper, or is it more toward form as in, the rhythm or the grid of a building, or for example, thresholds?
Yeah, I think I definitely use Grasshopper. I think Grasshopper is a great tool, but as is manually doing stuff in Rhino, as is 3D Max, as is programs like Houdini and Blender and processing. And what I'm interested in is not so much any kind of like given, I don't want to say formal agenda, but any straightforward formal agenda. I'm interested in the sort of blobs of Greg Lynn and Frank Gehry. I'm working on a project right now that I worry actually looks a little bit too similar to some of the stuff we saw in the early 90s. I think I disagree with a lot of the stuff that Patrick Schumacher says, but I love Zaha's buildings. I love the forms of those buildings. I think those are really interesting. But for me, it's never about any one specific pigeonholing any one specific formal agenda or way to approach form, as much as it is not being about diagrammatic form. If you think about like a big building, not to hate on big, but they describe the forms of their buildings. The best example is their new Vancouver house, which is basically a triangular site, which then sort of lofts up to a rectangular floor plate at the top. Formally, it's really interesting. It's a fascinating building. It's a fascinating feat of engineering to even pull that off. But when you can kind of describe the form in just one move like that, like it was inevitable and it came out of constraints outside itself, to me, that's not interesting. So when I talk about being interested in form, I think about things that seem to arise from maybe internal logics or things which are not necessarily abstract, but that are unusual. I think when you explore the sort of everyday, not necessarily vernacular, but when you explore like commercial architecture, when you explore sort of the random stuff that just happens in our cities that we don't normally think of as capital A architecture, there's a lot of strange stuff out there. And a lot of it we've grown accustomed to. And so I'm interested in form that sort of allows us to think differently, that we're maybe not used to, and allows us, again, going back to that idea about, realigning the way that we see things.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because when you were talking about having architecture in the background and how we think of things, like for example, in the city, how we see the city and stuff like that. I remembered Casa del Faccio in
Hmm.
Milan,
Hmm.
which is kind of like, when you go through there, it reminds you of the political time, right? Like propaganda and all that stuff when that was very prominent. But however, it's not the form per se that you're talking about. You're talking more about like innovative forms and
Yeah, I mean,
which
I
is pretty
think,
interesting.
yeah, the Casa de Fascio is an interesting one too. I mean, that it does remind you of a given time. We were studying this in my theory class this semester. I'm actually
Hmm.
looking at it right now. Um, yeah, that's obviously, I guess, sort of a modernist era building, of course. But yeah, I think for me, it's more not that I, I think that there's a lot of room for exploration, and so what I don't want to be is be a modernist about it and say we need to use boxes and
Yeah, exactly.
rectangles and grids, or be a Patrick Schumacher who says it no platonics. It needs to be all curves and fluid and stuff. What I tend to gravitate towards is more, but it sort of reads deconstructivist era stuff where you have things that have been sort of broken down in bits and pieces that sort of build things back up. I think to me that's a little more interesting than reading one overarching whole that just presents itself and it says this is the building.
Yeah.
I think there's more opportunity in that, but yeah, I'm not sure. It's something I'm continuing to explore. Is like what is the form that explores these ideas that I'm interested
Yeah.
in? And I think it changes. I think it can change from project to project, and I don't see any real reason to limit ourselves. If you can do it with an extruded gable, you're pretty good. That would be a pretty amazing feat. It would
Yeah.
just be cool if we saw a project like that made us rethink what it means to have an extruded gable building.
I think it's a very interesting way of, looking at architecture because if you tell me, all right, you have the ability to look at this building that has completely new shapes, new forms that I'm not familiar with,
Hmm.
and you tell me you can see a modern building, I'm gonna go with the form that it's very innovative, and it's also, you know, uh, how does it apply to how I feel emotionally when I go inside, what it reminds me of. So I think it's a very interesting take on, challenging what architecture is about. So I commend you for that. It's very interesting.
And I think too, I think in our like theory discussions, a lot of times we try to make these ultimatums, um, which is understandable, but because we're trying to figure it out for ourselves. But I think too often we sort of limit ourselves to say, no, that's been done in the past. We can't
Mm-hmm.
do that anymore. Um, I understand it, and I have certainly done that before. But I think recently what I've realized is one of the most liberating things. And there's again a more of a political process to this when you sort of step outside. When we think about representation in architecture, it's always been bad. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's always been a profession run by white men, and the canon of what we're taught has always been Western European white men buildings. And so I
Yeah.
think when you can kind of step outside the sort of like, I think, I think when you can kind of step outside those canons of like, this is what you have to do and this is what you have to pull from. And if symbolism is real, symbolism matters. And I think that we need to know like, there are certain forms that connote certain symbols. But I'm
Yeah.
very interested in the ways that we can sort of promiscuously grab from different historical legacies and pasts and forms and sort of recombine them in a way that is one just more representative of our world or the people that architecture serves, but also just sort of gives us more freedom as designers to pull from different things and to again realign our aesthetic sensibilities. um, I don't know, it's a tough balance because there's always symbolism imbued in form, and for too long we didn't understand that. But I do think that sort of prescribing our workflows, prescribing our canon, and prescribing the sort of forms that we pull from is just limiting. Like I think that we
Mm-hmm.
can we can do a lot more than that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also, particularly in architecture school, it's so important for people to look for that innovation and stray away from the modern
Yeah.
type thing, because you're there to, learn how to do things differently,
Yeah.
right? Obviously, in the real world, it's gonna be difficult because you have the zoning, building codes, and stuff like that. But if you actually go into architecture school, it is to make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think that's like one of the biggest things I would tell students is like don't
Right.
don't design buildings that you think could get built. Like that's you're gonna have if you go to a good architecture school, you're gonna get a good job. You're gonna work for some firm that's probably gonna do some cool modern stuff. And you'll get to see buildings realized that you'll enjoy, that are nicely detailed and might have some interesting forms, use nice materials, have nice space, nice light. All that stuff is important, of course. I'm not saying forget that stuff. But I think what's really powerful about architecture school, employers might disagree with this, but I don't really care. What's really important, the really value of architecture school is to push the discipline forward, is to think
Yeah.
about new ideas and new ways of thinking about architecture, and to expose both the industry and the world just to new possibilities. What you design now, granted, it's different from studio to studio. What your focus is on. An integrative studio or a comprehensive studio where you're dealing with detailing may not be the best studio to do this in. But I wouldn't worry about things like buildability. I wouldn't worry about things like feasibility or constructability.
Yeah.
Whether you feel like you could actually get some client to sign off on it. I wouldn't be concerned about those things. I think that the role of architecture, especially in school, is to, again, if it's about realigning our sensibilities, then it doesn't matter if that's actually a building or not, or if it's
Yep.
what you're doing is architecture. The model you make, the drawing you put on the wall is just as real and in the world, and is just as much quote architecture as the latest Herzog and de Meuron building. So
Yeah.
I think keeping that in mind and understanding like the projects you do now are not just they're not just the preseason to your career. Like they have agency on their own, and feeling there should be freedom in that. It shouldn't be a burden. It should be a freedom in knowing like this is a really cool opportunity that I have now, and just to take advantage of it.
Yeah. I always tell my students, for example, like, just forget about the rules. Just honestly, don't even look at the setbacks. I mean, obviously, you kind of have to abide by
Sure.
the dimensions and stuff like that of the site, but just don't look at the rules. If they tell you it has to be top 10 feet, you can just make it 11 feet. The world is not going to end.
Yeah.
Just do it.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're scared.
Sure. And we have a professor here who's really amazing. His name's David Heyman, and he talks about the only rule you have in school is gravity. That's the only thing that you can't.
I'm going to start using that quote.
Yeah, like you can't like that would be the only thing that you really would not be a fruitful discussion, would be like, well, this building doesn't apply to gravity.
Yeah.
Outside of that, zoning, any laws, the way that architecture, and he actually wrote a really good article in our yearly publication issue this year on this. The way that architecture has functioned historically is that it pushes the world forward through challenging, the laws, through zoning,
Yeah, exactly.
through variance to the zoning law. So yeah, I mean, I think that you almost could make an argument that there's almost an obligation to break the rules in some way. There's an obligation that if you care about, not just accepting the status quo as it is, we almost have an obligation in school to break the rules and to say, no, like it can be different. It should be different. Here's a world that we're proposing that should be different than the one that we're in now, and that the laws we're in now are supporting. And I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, definitely. So just, I guess the last question that I have for you, how does architecture change the way we see the world? Now, think about it, and I'm going to quote some of the people that have responded.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so for example, Ray Designs, he says, architecture is a representation of a certain history and cultural set against change in time. Then Flick Wilson, architecture is the geography of our built environment. It is a human manipulation of space. And then, oh man, I don't know how to pronounce that username. Well, I guess I'll put it below. Architecture is the way we see the world. Well, thank you. Then Augie's Dave says, design is essence of everyday function, only serve to enhance its attractiveness. Oh, look at this one. Harini.S. Mohem. People will never know that architects can't push the building beyond the offset. They have to. And then another one, Zoe, it says, it inspires the future.
Yeah, I think this is some really interesting takes on it. The one about basically it makes the world more attractive. I think I think at face value, we might laugh at that a little, not laugh at that, but we might think to ourselves, no, it's more than that. I think there's actually a really strong power in that. I was reading recently, I can't remember the author. It was, it's like a late 19th century, I believe, like philosopher theorist. It was talking about, a lot of the stuff that we talk about here when we theorize, when we talk about concepts and explain our buildings and stuff, like it's always at a cognitive level. But what he was saying is that the aesthetic level is what happens first. Like you've already lost a piece of resolution once you start explaining or describing or thinking about or theorizing. Whenever we start talking about this stuff, we've already lost a step behind the real thing or the real experience of architecture. And I think that's really strong. I mean, I think that the stuff that we do, I mean, nobody else goes around looking at our buildings talking about, oh, I wonder what the concept behind this was. They go,
I know, right?
They look at it and go, oh, that's cool, or oh, that sucks. And that's really, I think there's some really interesting stuff in there. I think that's kind of the point that I'm making is, to their point, like it serves to make things more attractive. Like that's not a superficial thing. Architecture is the thing that trains us in the way that we look at the things around us, trains us at the world around us. And so if architecture is a one-note, a one-liner, a diagram of a building that you go by and go, oh, I get it, that trains us to, in a way, indirectly, it's not, I don't want to overstate that the effects that architecture can have on us, but that does, in a way, train us to say then, okay, I get it when I read the headline. I know what's going on. Oh, that's all that there is. There's nothing deeper. There's no nuance. There's no complexity. I don't need to understand those people who are different from me. And I know that seems like a logical stretch. I'm not trying to say that, diagrammatic buildings, that big buildings are the reason why we have hate and misunderstanding and the current political crisis we're in. That's not at all the case. But there is a power in architecture which draws us to look closer, which sort of confuses and misunderstands things and wants us to sort of figure them out for ourselves and on our own terms. And not just, and this is sort of similar to postmodernism, except that postmodernism would have said that it's kind of a free-for-all. It's like whatever you want to read into it is what you read into it. Mm-hmm. What I'm interested in is it's all actually there. And that's sort of the world we live in, right? Is we talk a lot about experience and sort of your lived reality is real, that's and deserves to be understood. Mm-hmm. That's not subjective. That's not this. It's not this oh, it's just reality is whatever you want it to be. It's no, there's just a lot of people in this world with different backgrounds and who experience things differently. And the more that we can come to realize that, the more that we can come to sort of understand that the world is a lot more vast and a lot more complex and a lot more nuanced than we realize. And we can't just draw simple conclusions about everything. We can't just draw ideologies out of everything, certain issues, certain peoples, etc. I think that the better served our culture and our society will be from it. Again, architecture's role in that, super indirect. I'm not trying to say that we're going to save the world by making complex buildings, but it can help.
But it definitely can.
It can realign our sensibilities.
I think that architecture is so much more than just construction and building. Mm-hmm. Architecture is psychological, political, social, cultural. You have to know about these things in order to be a good architect. It's like
Absolutely.
architecture is a very well-rounded profession.
Hmm.
You have to know about what's going on right now, the current time, what happened in the past, what happened in the modern era. You have to know about a lot of things in order to actually, design something that is going to be aesthetically pleasing, and so people actually have a nice experience when they go in it and that they actually want to go inside, you
Right.
know? So,
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. We do ourselves injustice when we oversimplify things because we're
yeah,
dealing with, as you just said, I mean, you're dealing with history, you're dealing with, not just history of architecture, but history of culture and people and
the
context.
world, yeah.
You're dealing with construction issues, but you're also dealing with, society. You're dealing with politics. Building is always, outside of, single family homes out in the middle of nowhere, like building is always a political process. You're dealing with laws, you're dealing with zoning. If it's a public building, it's especially political.
Hmm.
And to your point, I think architects, we know we juggle a lot
Yeah.
we put on a lot of hats. I mean, the way I talk to fabricators versus the way I'm talking to you now is totally different.
Hmm.
And I think that's okay. I think, if our buildings can sort of imbue a little bit of that, I think it's a beautiful thing about being an architect. I think it's bigger than
Yeah.
architecture, that sort of juggling. But I think our
That's awesome.
architecture can actually imbue the sort of processes that we go through. I think it'll only make richer cities, richer places to be in a better world.
Yeah, for sure. All right, one last question. I just thought about it. What is a piece of advice that you would give to someone starting architecture right now?
Ooh, someone's starting architecture right now. I'm trying to think because I already talked a little bit about like don't worry about
Right.
constructability and all that stuff, which I think is a big thing. But I think if you're starting architecture school right now, I remember when I started architecture school or when I started design school, I felt like I couldn't design anything until I knew stuff like um, how big doors were and how big windows are. And like
Yeah.
I just had no concept of scale of space
Oh my God.
in order to even get started. And I would
Yes.
say to somebody starting in school, like who's just starting architecture, like, or if you're in your first year and you just finished your design one classes and you're like, I want to design an actual building, not these stupid design exercises. Because I remember being frustrated with those too. I was like, no, I want to design architecture, not these like compositional stuff.
Yeah.
I now, like looking back on it, love those exercises so much. Like I wish I had enjoyed those exercises more because they just open up possibilities that you didn't think were possible. So
Hmm.
my advice to somebody who is starting to school would be like, don't feel like you have to know anything to design stuff. Like your background, your upbringing, your way of seeing the world, whatever your like intuition about architecture, design, composition, whenever you're going through those stuff, it's valuable when we need it. So like you have just as much a right to be here as I do in my like eighth year of school now. So that's the first thing. And second, I would say like just like use those things to develop stuff that maybe we haven't seen before. Like don't be concerned about don't be worried about getting it wrong.
Yeah.
Don't be worried about
Or
pleasing, even pleasing your professors. Your professors are there for a good reason, and like they know a lot. But if you have a clear idea about stuff, yeah, don't feel like you have to stick to the canon of what you're being taught. I think that's really important. I think it's really important to develop for yourself a sense of like, what do I want my architecture to be? What ideas do I want to explore, and run with it? And I think most professors will help you understand and realize those things. But they grew up most of your professors will have grown up in a different era of architecture and have different ideas about that. Um, and so sometimes it's okay to piss off your professors a little bit.
yeah. All right. Well, that was awesome. It was a very interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Davis.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you. I'm so honored that you wanted me at all in the first place, and especially honored to be the first one on the podcast. So I'm
I
excited to
mean,
see what the archaeologist has in store. It's been fun following you guys for the last year
thank
or so.
you. I mean, honestly, I thought about picking you first because you are an inspiration. I mean, you're very young. How old
Hmm.
are you, if you don't mind me asking?
How old am I? What is it? 2019? I'm 26.
You're
I can't
26.
even I can't even remember
You
anymore.
have achieved so much. I mean, you have a book out, Going Tiny.
Hmm.
You've done like conferences. You were on TED Talk. That's crazy. That's
Yeah,
that's amazing.
it's been fun. It's been cool. I've had some awesome opportunities that have. Most of it has been because being at UT has been really great. They've opened a lot of doors. I am constantly in awe of the people that I come across, particularly on Instagram, designers and stuff. And so, yeah, I've been lucky to get to do some stuff. But there's a lot of people out there who are a lot more talented than me. And so it's
so
it's a
humble.
really it's a really exciting. Well, it's just a really exciting time to be
Yeah.
architecture. So I'm
Yeah.
excited to see what a lot of these people that you're sharing and that we're following get to do.
Awesome. All right, friends, there you have it. Thank you for tuning in today. That was episode number 1 with Davis Richardson. And if you're not following yet, you have to follow The Archaeologist on social media. Do so right now. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest, and many more. Also, you should go to our website, thearchaeologist.com. See you on the next episode, guys. Goodbye.